Good to see you all here this morning as we continue to celebrate Easter and the resurrection of Christ in our lives. This week we're starting a series called The Game of Life, and I know many of you remember playing the game of life when you were growing up as kids, or maybe you're still playing it. In fact, in some ways we still are, even as adults. If you remember back when the game, you got a little plastic car, right? And then you got a little plastic person that sat in the car in the driver's seat, and but after I had kids, I let them chauffeur me around, so I would move to the back. No, I'm kidding. So you had this little car, and then you had to choose. You had this path that you follow around the game board, and this path directs you. And the first thing you do is you just decide whether to do a career or college, and then you have to stop and get married, whether you like it or not. You have to stop and buy a house, whether you like it or not. Then you have all these life experiences. You have kids, or sometimes you have twins, and you fill up your car and of all these little plastic people, and you move around the board, and then there are different places on the board where you have to make a decision which way you're going to go. And my decision was always based on how many paydays I could count between there. If I had 3 paydays this way, I was going that way, because in the end, the winner of the game is the one who has the money, right? And so you want to retire to millionaire estates and win the game, and that's what the game is about. And so we learn this from a very early age, that this is the way life works, that this is what life may be about. I want to ask a couple questions, though, as we think about this, because I think in some ways we still, in reality, participate in that game of life. We still do those things. I mean, it reflects life to a certain degree, and we're attempting to do those things. So a couple questions that I wrestle with and one of the questions is this really what life is all about? Is this all there is to life? Is just college, home, family, kids, retire? Is that all there is to life? That's a good question. And then, what happens when life doesn't go as we plan it? What happens when the house gets foreclosed on? What happens when we are not able to have kids? What happens when we're not able to get that dream job, or if we lose our job? What happens when the marriage doesn't go the way we had hoped it, or we don't even get married, and we have wanted to get married? And so what do we do when life doesn't go as planned or as we plan it? And part of that question, too, is, does God have a plan for our lives that may be different than our plans? And if so, how do we understand and get on board with God's plan for our life and not just live our lives based on our plans? So we're going to be kind of unpacking that over the next few weeks. And today I'm not going to answer all those questions. I know you were hoping I was going to hit them all this morning. I know you were like, yeah, can we get it all today? But my time allotment will not allow that. So I want to talk about this morning just about that first question. Is that really all there is to life? Is this game of life really what life is all about? I don't know if you've heard this week that Rick Warren's son passed away. He committed suicide on Friday. And I had planned to talk about Rick Warren's book and some of the things out of his book this morning. And if you read the Pastor Pondering this week, it was about some of the teachings of Rick Warren about this. And I was sad to hear that on Friday morning he had killed himself. He was suffering from severe mental illness. He was suffering from depression. And just a couple things that reminded me of. One is pastors are real people, and they have real families, and they struggle and have issues just like any other family. And mental illness is the other thing it reminded me, is that mental illness is real. And we have young people struggling with mental illness even here in our community. So I'd invite you to keep those who struggle with mental illness in your prayers. Keep Pastor Warren and his family in your prayers this morning as they struggle through this season of their life and this time of grief in their life. And just to remember that, pastors have tough times. They're not immune to problems, and that's important. That was an important reminder for me as well. And the other thing it reminded me of, lastly, and I know this is a tangent, because this is not what the sermon is about, but the tangent here is that don't follow me. Don't follow Rick Warren. We're not called to follow pastors. We're called to follow Jesus. And our role as pastors is to point you to Jesus and not to ourselves. To point you to following Jesus, because Jesus is the life we want you to pursue and imitate and live life after. If you're following me, you're in big trouble. But a reminder that even pastors aren't, and pastors' families aren't perfect, even though sometimes we expect them to be. And we got to keep, I'd encourage you to keep that in mind. Follow Jesus and not just human beings. So Rick Warren actually talked about in his book, In the Purpose-Driven Life, and he talked about this on a recent TED Talk, if you're familiar on the internet with TED Talks. He talked about how we live at 3 different levels. We can live at the level of survival, or we can live at the level of success, or we can live at the level of significance. And we can help determine which level we live at. We, in some ways, have to wrestle with that. What level of life do I want to live at? I can live at the level of survival, and some people are living at the level of survival in different ways, depending on what's going on in their lives. Some people are living at the level of success. They're trying to be successful and have it all. They're playing the game of life, so to speak. And then there are others who live at the level of significance. And what does that look like? And I really want to talk more about what it looks like to live at the level of significance this morning, meaning, purpose. You know, Jesus was clear about his purpose when he came. Jesus' life he was very clear about it. He said in Luke chapter 4, verse 43, which we read this morning, he said, I must proclaim the good news of the kingdom of God to the other cities also, for I was sent for this purpose. He clearly knew what his purpose was. He clearly knew what the reason was that he came to this planet and came to earth. He understood that. Now my question is, what level was Jesus living at? Survival, success, or significance? Because here's the other thing. Jesus didn't play the game of life. Jesus didn't get married, didn't buy a house, didn't have kids, didn't pursue a career. He lived life at a significant level, and it's significant not only for the world, for that time and day, but even significant for us. And that's the point, is to live at the level of significance does not require us to do the things that we think is a part of this life that we think. Some of the things we think about will not lead to significance, and it's possible to experience significance without some of those things. And so significance is that level of living that doesn't always require some of those things. Now, we're actually probably most of the time trying to pursue happiness. A member of a church shared with me an article entitled, What is the Good Life? And that's a great question. And in the article, it talks about some research, and it talks about the difference between how we define the good life. That some of us want to be happy. And happiness most people define as stress-free. Like if we can not be stressed out, then we'll be happy people. And so we try and arrange our lives not to be stressed. So we try and do things to relieve stress in our lives. Now, one thing I've noticed, though, the more that we have, over the past decades, the more that we have accomplished and been successful, it seems that the more stress we have. And so some of this leads to more stress. And yet we've defined happiness often as human beings as a stress-free life. Now, part of the article also points out that being happy has to do about getting something or doing something for myself. It has to do with giving myself something. That's what happiness is, or stress, getting de-stressed, or less stress. Whereas living a life of meaning is about giving myself to others, or encountering others, or being a part of a cause. So that provides meaning to our lives versus happiness. And so we can live with meaning and really not be happy, if that makes any sense, by our definition of happiness. But we can have meaning and live fulfilled lives. You know, Viktor Frankl, who was in concentration camps in World War II, wrote that famous book called Man's Search for Meaning. And in it he says this, he says, being human always points and is directed to something or someone other than oneself. Being it a meaning to fulfill or another human being to encounter. The more one forgets himself by giving himself to a cause to serve or another person to love, the more human he is. You hear that? The more human he or she is. So pursuing a life of meaning and significance and the possibility of that. So I want to ask that question, explore that a little bit more. What does it look like for us to discover a life of meaning, a life of purpose, a life of significance in our lives, to be able to do that? Well, the one thing I want to point out in Jeremiah chapter 1, verse 5, is a great verse in Jeremiah, which God is talking to the prophet Jeremiah, and God says this. God says, before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. You hear that? I knew you. And before you were born, I consecrated you. I appointed you a prophet to the nations. And so clearly what God is saying to Jeremiah, you're significant. You were significant before you were even born, because God saying, I formed you, Jeremiah, and I knew you. And I hope that if there's nothing else you take away from the sermon this morning, if you fall asleep right now and go to sleep for the rest of the service, that's fine. But know this, you are significant to God. Your life matters to God. You are important to God. God knows you. You are known by God, and nothing will ever change that. The other thing about it is God created you and I in a unique way. Look at the person next to you. Go ahead. You can look around. Look at the people next to you. Are they the same as you? Right? They're better looking, but are they the same, you know? Right. So keep that in mind. When you look at that other person, God created that other person and knows that other person, and that other person is created by God in the way that God wanted them to be created. Does that make sense? Not how we want them to be created, although we'd like to change that, don't we? But the reality is that God made them, and God thinks they're important and significant, and God values them just the way God created them and formed them, just like Jeremiah, just like you, just like I. So to know that we're significant is important. I mean, that's the whole reason Jesus was sent into the world. Jesus came to give his life as a ransom for many. Jesus came to give his life and to be resurrected. That's what we celebrated last week, that Jesus is risen. And his purpose was to bring that good news to us and to help us to know that God loves us and is significant, and God wants us to return home and be a part of God's life and to have God in our lives and to know that we're significant, to turn our lives over to God, to God's purposes. That's why Jesus came. And that was what was significant about Jesus' life. So Jesus and Jeremiah both had a clear sense of their identity, about who they were, and they also had a clear sense of their purpose and why they had been put on this planet. So the questions I think we have to wrestle with is, how do we discern that? How do we know that for our lives? So we know we're significant to God. What has God created us for? So one of the questions we have to ask is the same question that the same thing that Jeremiah was told. How did God form me? How did God form you? Another way of putting it in my own guy terms is, how did God wire me or you? How are we wired? Now, do we have any amateur electricians here in the building this morning? And we've all had, how many people have ever had to install something electrical, like a ceiling fan or something, or wire something in a car, or an appliance, or put a cord on a dryer? I don't know. I'm like an amateur electrician, so this is way beyond my pay grade here this morning. But the idea here is that, I remember going and getting a ceiling fan, and, there's this hole in my ceiling. It's about the extent of my electrical experience. And I know there's a black wire and a white wire coming out of my ceiling. Okay, that's it. Pretty simple. I like things simple. I go and buy the fan that has the remote control on it, so I can just, I don't even have to move. I just push a button and it comes on and off, and the lights, and it's got a dimmer system on it, and it's got variable speeds and everything, so I get all that stuff on it. So I pull the fan out of the box, and there's all these wires that come with it. Now I'm looking at a black wire and a white wire, and I'm looking at a box full of blue, yellow, orange, green, purple, white, black wire, all these different color wires, and I'm scratching my head going, okay, which wire goes to which? How do I figure out how to wire it so that it works, so that the light goes on, right? Or the fan goes on, or the remote control works? And here's where I wish the electricians of the world would unite and just come together and like make all the wires color coordinated, Like if it's a black wire, it goes to a black wire. A blue wire goes to a blue wire. A red wire goes, does that make sense? No, it makes too much sense. But anyway, what do I know? I'm not an electrician. So there's these things I have to figure out how to wire this device so that it makes the right connection so the light goes off. In the similar way, we have to discern and understand how God has wired us, how God has formed us, because when we make the right connection to God and how God has wired us, the light goes on in our lives. The light comes on in us to other people. So, one of the things, I grew up in the church, and some of you know that I wasn't always a fan of church. And so, again, it's a warning that if you're running away from church, look out. God's going to make you a pastor if you're running away. So the other thing, I was running away, and my mom had always said, when you're 16, you don't have to go to church anymore. So I couldn't wait till I was 16. I wanted to get out of the church. And so at that point in my life, I did not feel that the church was helping me to connect to God. The light, the wiring was not happening. The light was not going on for me in my connection to God. And it was actually people outside the church, people outside my faith community that shared Christ with me and helped me to connect to God. And actually, that was part of God's call for me to come back to the church and call the church and encourage the church to connect with people outside the church. Because one of the times that the light goes off for me is when I'm talking with people who don't go to church or outside of our church life, or who we would say are non-religious people. And so I have conversation with them, and I can have conversations about them with God, and I can see them learning about God and taking steps of faith and moving towards God, and that's when I get joy. That's when I start to feel the light going off in me, and then I feel God's wiring connecting in me, and I know that I'm doing what I was meant to do to a certain degree. And I also believe that about people in the church, too. There are times when I feel the light going on when I help people in the church make that connection as well. Well, the cool thing for me always is when I'm talking with these folks, because a lot of times they don't know I'm a pastor. They just think I'm just this average random person, and they don't know a whole lot about me. And then they find out I'm a pastor, and they're like, no way. You're like a real person. How could you be a pastor, Because that's the thing. Again, that goes back to we think pastors are not real. And we are. We're real people. And our job is to help point people to God and make that connection to Christ, not to point to ourselves. And so when we're doing that, that's when I feel the light going off. That's when the wiring is right for me. So we know when our wiring, when we're connecting with what God has for us, when we're making a difference in other people's lives, when we're helping other people connect to God, we know that's God's light. We know the wiring is starting to fire, and that's different for all of us. That's just the way God wired me. It's not necessarily the way God wired you or others. So the other question then we have to understand too is not only how did God form me, or how did God wire me, or how did God create me, but what did God create me for? What's the plan? What's the purpose? As Rick Warren said in his book, what on earth am I here for? Is it just to play this game of life, or is there more to it than that? How can I live at that level of significance? So we have to answer that question as well. Now stay with me on this illustration. You're going to wonder where I'm going with this, but we'll get there. How many people heard in the news a couple weeks ago that Voyager 1, spacecraft Voyager 1, launched in 1977, had left the solar system? Did anybody hear that in the news? It had left the solar system, right? Well, that only lasted about 3 hours, okay? They reported that it left the solar system, and then NASA came out with another report and said, no, it hasn't left the solar system. So just by way of warning, does anybody here work for NASA? Anybody NASA folks in here? I know we have some around here. Yeah, we got some NASA folks. You're too young to work for NASA in the back row. So I went to NASA, and they were saying, no, the Voyager 1 has not left the solar system. So it turns out there's a debate going on whether or not Voyager 1 has left the solar system. Now, what some scientists are saying is that what's happened is that Voyager 1 has left the reach of the sun's radiation, or the cosmic rays of the sun, and so it's beyond that point of reach to the sun's rays, and so based on that definition, it's left the solar system. Whereas NASA is saying, no, it's still within the magnetic field, or the gravitational pull of the sun, and so it hasn't left the solar system. So this is the argument. And I thought religious scholars were debating everything and splitting hairs. But anyway, my interpretation of this is it's a long way away. It's just far away. 11.3 billion miles from the sun is where it's at right now. I guess that's the most accurate description. But has it left the solar system? And there's still some thinking it may not leave the solar system. The gravitational pull may keep it in, or other properties in the universe may push it back into the solar system. So we don't know how far out it's going to go, or whether it will go far out. Because there's something happening within our solar system that keeps all our planets around the sun, and that keeps things from going out of the solar system. And what is that? It's the law of gravity, right? And so no matter how far it tries to go, there's a possibility it's going to come back in. No matter how far we try and get away from God, or get away from God's purposes in our life, there's going to be this pull, this tug within our spirit that just keeps pulling us back. We can't get away from it. And so that's how we know when we're maybe stumbling upon God's purpose for our lives. There's that tug within us that just we can't let go of. it just keeps pulling us back. It may be a need we see in the world that we want to meet, and it just keeps being put on our spirit to meet that need. Or it may be a group of people that God calls us to love that we just can't get away from that, and God keeps putting it on our heart or our spirit to meet that need or to love those people. We don't know what it is, but we just can't get away from it, is what I'm saying. You know, I have like 10 great ideas every day. None of them happen because it's not what I was made for. Does that make sense? We have all kinds of great ideas, but not all of them are about what we're wired for and what we're created for. It's the ones that we feel pulled over and over and over again back to is a sign of discerning what God may be calling us for. So what is it that God keeps tugging your heart about, tugging your spirit about, keeps pulling you towards? That may have something to do with your purpose and your life's purpose. You know, there was a young man, his name was George, and George was the son of a barber. And his dad was one of the greatest barbers in the community. I mean, he was a great businessman. He ran a barber shop, and everybody came to get their hair cut from him. And he absolutely thought that his son's purpose was to take over the barber shop, to be a great barber, just like his father. And young George, he actually started, anytime you would put George in a room with an instrument, he would gravitate to that musical instrument and start tinkering around with it or playing with it. And one day, George and his father were at the home of a wealthy man in the community, and that wealthy gentleman saw George playing around with the instrument and playing this music and trying to figure it out. And he said, you know, your son has a gift. Your son, it keeps gravitating towards me. You ought to give him lessons. And George's father at first thought, no, you know, musicians, they're not good people, you know. They don't make any money, and they won't be successful. Besides, I need him to take over the family business. And so George's father thought, you know, to please this other person in our community, because I'm an upstanding businessman in the community, I'm going to, you know, give my son lessons just to kind of please this other person in the business community. And so they did that. And so he started to take lessons, and George just came alive. I mean, the more George took lessons, the more he loved music, the more he wanted to play music, the more he wanted to be involved in music. And George actually became a professional musician. He wasn't the greatest businessman in the whole world. In fact, he found himself in deep debt later in life, and he found himself making some very poor business decisions, and he wasn't that great of a business person, and he never took over his father's business. And he actually became very ill at one point in his life, and actually toward the end of his life, he suffered with illness. And it was actually during that time of poverty and survival, he was living at the level of survival financially, and then he was also sick and ill. And that's the moment, that's the time that he wrote one of the greatest pieces of music that you and I know, called Messiah. His name was George Handel. And he wrote Messiah at that point in his life. Now I want you to think about that. Was that significant? It was significant. He was just simply he didn't know how significant it was going to be when he wrote it, but he knew how God had wired him and God had formed him. And he knew he was to be a musician, and he was to play music and compose music. And so he was living a level of significance. And out of that level of significance, you and I we're blessed with a great piece of music that praised God and praised the Son of God. That he found that place that God had created him for. And thanks be to God he did that. And thanks be to God to you and I when we do that. Thanks be to God. Amen.